Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. We'll give it a minute for everyone to join. Good morning. A big welcome to everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to join. People are still trickling in, which is really great to see. Good morning. Just another few seconds until we get started. Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this media briefing on how Feminist is Budget 2024. Obviously, we've seen a lot of commentary already over the last 12 hours, but we feel it's really important to bring a feminist perspective to this as well. So I'm joining you today from the Oxfam Canada office. My name is Deanna Sorosi. I'm the Director of Policy, Campaigns and Communications. The Oxfam office is located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin First Nation. We recognize the long-standing relationship the Algonquin have with this territory that has been nurtured since time immemorial. I also want to pay respect to all First Nations, Métis and Inuit on the lands that we now know as Canada. I acknowledge the historical and ongoing oppression and colonization of the people and the loss of culture and land. I want to recognize the valuable past, present, and future contributions of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit as customary keepers and defenders of this territory. We honor their culture, knowledge, leadership, and courage. And as settlers, we recognize this first step in a long journey toward decolonization and move towards reconciliation. So with that, I'm actually not going to take up much time and get started right away with our first speaker for today. I would like to introduce Arella Dugal from the Canadian Women's Foundation. Over to you, Anu.
Thanks, Diana. Good morning, everyone. I am coming to you from traditional unceded territories of the Kanien'kehá:ka in an area that is traditionally known as Tiohtià:ke and now called Montreal. I was in the budget lockup yesterday with some colleagues, and I have to say my reactions are mitigated. I can't say that I was really thrilled. We were really hoping on my part for some funding, some additional funding from WAGE that would focus on sustainability, especially of national women's organizations, especially of rights organizations. This in light of a sector that is facing a downturn in charitable giving with increased demands on their work. And with this lack of funding, directly from WAGE for those services, of course, we're disappointed. However, I will say I was sitting at the table with some young women who had been working extremely hard on increasing funding for grants in higher education. There had been no increase in their area of work for 21 years, and the increased funding that will help young young people related to student financial assistance, grants for higher education, funding for research and academia, as well as incentives for those who would be working in rural, remote and northern communities, is certainly historic. And I think there are also important investments on TS-LGBTQ community and the Red Dresser Alert, which I will leave others to highlight. We were hoping for direct funding, particularly because the government had declared an epidemic of gender-based violence in relation to the recommendations of the Mass Casualty Commission. And what is in the budget is really related to the amounts that were already announced this year. Seems most of this support is going to public safety and RCMP, gun control and some change in laws related to coercive control, which again, I'm sure other people will dive into far deeper. The Canada disability benefit is low, incredibly low, and I don't think it meets the needs of women, the 27% of women who live with disabilities, what they will be needing, particularly as that number has grown recently. Some welcome investments in the care economy, the idea of establishing a sectoral table that will lead to a national caregiving strategy is interesting. I am always conscious, and I'm sure everybody around the table is today, that when national sectoral tables are established, they must be established with a very strong commitment to those who work most in that area, so migrant women and racialized women, of course. And before I finish, I will just say the investments in digital safety are very important, given that hate crimes have increased and that much of that online hate in digital spaces is directed at women, to LGBTQ+ people, racialized people, and different faith groups.
Wonderful, great, Anu, a great snapshot of a whole bunch of things. Thank you. Next, we have Lise Martin from Women's Shelters Canada.
Thank you for allowing me to share a few words this morning. My remarks will focus on two aspects of the budget: the Women and Children's Shelter and Transitional Housing Initiative and addressing gender-based violence. Although yesterday's budget includes $52.9 billion in new funding over the next 5 years, very few of these investments will reach the majority of the women that are receiving services from the 600 violence against women shelters, of whom many are amongst the most marginalized in the country, namely Black, Indigenous, and racialized women and women with disabilities. We are extremely disappointed that the Women and Children's Shelter and Transitional Housing Initiative was not renewed. Of all the programs under the National Housing Strategy, this was the most impactful in meeting the needs of women and their children fleeing violence. The investment of $250 million in budget 2021 supported the construction, renovation, and repair of GBV shelter beds and transitional housing units. Despite demonstrating to policymakers and parliamentarians the value and success of this initiative, the government failed to renew it in this latest budget. The initiative was 4 times oversubscribed, with demand far exceeding available funding. Today, there remains dozens of shovel-ready projects across the country that would have greatly benefited from the initiative's renewal and could have saved the lives of women and children fleeing violence. In addition to being a program that directly met the needs of shelters and transition homes, it is a program that was delivered directly from the federal government and thus not susceptible to provincial and territorial interventions and the often associated delays in decision-making. Secondly, we are extremely disappointed that there are no new investments to address the ongoing epidemic of gender-based violence. We are also disappointed with the disability benefits introduced in the budgets, as women with disabilities are extremely vulnerable to gender-based violence. Gender-based violence markedly increased during the pandemic and has not slowed since. The federal government made substantive investments to address the issue in their 2021 and 2022 budgets. With the exception of limited investments linked to missing and murdered Indigenous women, there is no new funding in this budget to address the issue, including no further investments in the federal government's federal strategy to end gender-based violence. This points to a lack of commitment to gender-based violence, an issue which society as a whole needs to make a priority. We believe the federal government has a leadership role to play in addressing gender-based violence, and this definitely was not reflected in yesterday's budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Lise. Yes, a whole lot of disappointments there. I'll pass it over to Erin Bitmore from the Ending Violence Association of Canada.
Thanks, everyone. Good morning. My name is Erin Bitmore. I'm the Executive Director of the Ending Violence Association of Canada, or EVA Canada. I am going to focus my remarks this morning on a consideration of Budget 2024 through a gender-based violence lens, with a particular consideration of the budget's commitments and gaps in addressing sexual violence. The Ending Violence Association of Canada notes new federal government commitments in Budget 2024 that make some effort to respond to the ongoing epidemic of gender-based violence. These include investments to address workplace sexual harassment, to combat online harm, as well as hate against the 2S LGBTQ+ community, investments to co-develop with Indigenous partners a regional red dress alert system, and investments to support the buyback of assault-style firearms. EVA Canada was also encouraged to see investments aimed at improving access to mental health supports, including $500 million over 5 years in federal funding for a new youth mental health fund. Given significant barriers in access to mental health services across the country, improving supports for youth mental health is imperative. We urge government to note that sexual violence and abuse unfortunately remains a common experience in the lives of young people, and that such violence often carries significant mental health consequences. We are hopeful that these new investments consider the mental health needs of youth survivors of sexual violence, as well as the organizations that support them through funding to specialized sexual violence services. While these initiatives are important steps, as Lise has noted, Budget 2024 makes no additional investments to the federal government's National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence or to the federal strategy to end gender-based violence. It also does not provide measures or acknowledge the urgent need for additional investments to stabilize the gender-based violence sector and its workforce. In particular, EVA Canada is concerned that there continues to be limited investments to ensure the stabilization of sexual assault centers and specialized sexual violence services. While we recognize that funding for these services often falls under provincial and territorial jurisdiction, we believe the federal government, as the coordinator of the National Action Plan, has an essential role to play in ensuring the significant funding gap to sexual assault centers and related services is addressed in a consistent and comprehensive manner across the country. Earlier this month, Survivors Hope Crisis Center, a sexual assault center in Manitoba, had to start a GoFundMe campaign to keep its sexual assault recovery and healing counseling program open for survivors of sexual violence, following the end of federal project-based funding. Sexual assault centers are an integral part of the response and prevention efforts to address gender-based violence. However, currently, many sexual assault centers, like Survivors Hope Crisis Center, continue to rely on fundraisers or limited and precarious project-based funding to provide what should be recognized by the federal government in its budget as an essential public health service for survivors of sexual violence. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Erin. Next, we move over to Amanda Arella from YWCA Canada.
Thank you so much. Good morning. I share my colleagues' disappointment in some of the significant gaps in Budget 2024, particularly around ending gender-based violence. And at this time, I'll be focusing my remarks, however, on 2 areas where YWCAs are providing frontline service in communities across Canada, in housing and in childcare. It was positive to see that the government is willing to invest in ending the housing crisis, but we think that more targeted investments are needed than were provided in Budget 2024 to end the impacts of this crisis on women, girls, and gender diverse people. We know that women and gender diverse people are facing some of the most significant housing need in Canada, and particularly for those fleeing violence, face complex and unique barriers for accessing housing. Like Women's Shelters Canada, we are very disappointed that the Government of Canada chose not to build on its previous successes in addressing women's homelessness and gender-based violence through the renewal of Budget 2021's Women and Children Shelter and Transitional Housing Initiative. Although there was acknowledgement of the critical and life-saving role that women's shelters play in Canada's housing continuum, there was missing dedicated funding in Budget 2024. However, we see opportunities within that budget to work with the federal and government to ensure that all women and women-led families have a safe and affordable place to call home. We were happy to see a dedicated commitment to supporting women's shelters and transitional houses through the Affordable Housing Fund. Nonetheless, this commitment needs to be quantified. The National Housing Strategy has a commitment that 25% of all funds would be dedicated to projects for women. This commitment must be explicitly included in the newly announced Canada's Housing Plan to ensure that women's shelters and women-led housing are appropriately prioritized and funded by the federal government. We also saw promising investments in Budget 2024 in Canada's care economy and national system of early learning and childcare. As the second largest provider of childcare in Canada, YWCA Canada is very pleased to see $1 billion in low-cost loans and, more importantly, $60 million in grants to support the construction of nonprofit childcare spaces. This investment, in connection with further federal investments to increase training for early childhood educators, will be very crucial to ensuring that every child and every family has access to high-quality and affordable childcare in Canada. We were also happy to see proposals of a sectoral table on the care economy and the development of a national caregiving strategy, two very promising steps to strengthen Canada's care economy. We know that investing in care work supports workers, the communities they serve, and Canada as a whole. The care economy and the community services sector are essential to supporting the overall Canadian economy and our feminized workforce. So we look forward to learning more and participating in these two initiatives.
Great, thanks so much, Amanda. Right over to Emily Coyle from the Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies.
Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm working on the territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, colonially known as Ottawa, but our overall work takes place across Turtle Island or Canada. And it is with keen interest that I'm joining with all of the rest of these feminist leaders on the call. The Canadian Association of Elizabeth Fry Societies has been working alongside criminalized women and gender diverse people since 1978. And it is the ways in which those criminalized women and gender diverse people are routinely excluded from community and denied their humanity, which is, of course, an important intersectional feminist issue, that is the lens through which we looked at this budget this year and at budgets in previous years. So first, we looked at the prevention of criminalization lens, and through that lens, we applaud, of course, the reproductive justice investments in universal contraception, the childcare and school food program, the assault-style firearms buyback program, the investment in responding to hate directed towards 2S LGBTQIA+ communities, the red dress alert, the youth mental health investments, and of course, the focus on housing affordability. So many of the women and gender diverse people that we work with and alongside are parents, and they struggle to find safe and adequate housing options. We're especially eager to see how the Renters' Bill of Rights and the Tenant Protection Fund will include protection for criminalized women and gender diverse people, because a criminal record can be a reason on its own to deny someone a place to live. But when coupled with other forms of marginalization, it can leave the people that we work with in perpetual cycles of homelessness. However, on the prevention side, we echo others' disappointments not to see an ongoing commitment to fund the important work happening across the feminist sector. A thriving feminist civil society is a key component of a healthy, caring, and thriving country, and this budget certainly left that out. As for responding to criminalization, we see an investment in criminal justice legal aid in this budget where there was none last year. And we also see an investment in the recruitment and appointment of more judges in order to ensure faster access to trials. We're really interested in the investments made, small investments, $2 million over a few years, into the expansion of race and culture assessments for Black and other racialized people within the criminal legal system, which are similar, we are imagining, to the GLADU system for Indigenous peoples. We will also be watching closely the investments made to public safety and the RCMP towards responding to the recommendations made in the final report of the Mass Casualties Commission. The final report very clearly stated that the government needed to fund organizations that were responding to gender-based violence at epidemic levels of funding. We will be asking how the $77 million investment over 5 years will be divided up, and how much of this is specifically earmarked for the RCMP is unclear. And so, as with each budget, we will continue to advocate for ways to action the goals of prevention of criminalization and recriminalization across this country. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Emily. Next, we'll be hearing from Debbie Owusu-Achea from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity.
Good morning. Thank you so much for that welcome, Deanna, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm honored to be joining these other feminist leaders to provide our perspective on the budget. So the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity welcomes the adoption of previous recommendations for dedicated funding addressing anti-2S LGBTQ hate. Last year, CCGSD actually spoke about our disappointment regarding the lack of commitments, especially as we're dealing with significant hate targeted towards trans and gender diverse communities. The $12 million commitment over 5 years to the Department of Women and Gender Equality to fund projects aimed at combating hate sends a really excellent signal to 2S LGBTQ communities that our concerns are being heard. However, we are thinking about whether or not 2.4 million a year is actually enough. With the significant rate of hate against queer and trans people increasing significantly, the targeting of LGBTQ communities, as well as that explicit warning from CSIS on the significant threats to our communities, the 2.4 million a year sends the message, yes, we hear you, but you're gonna need to figure out the rest. Budget 2024 also doesn't include a further top-up for 2S LGBTQ capacity building projects. This means that those of us who are actually successful in recently receiving capacity funding are going to be the last to have that come the end of that funding window in 2026. This is going to result in issues our sector has been speaking about for years. A further reliance for LGBTQ organizations to be creative with project funding to sustain costs to keep our doors open. This sends an even more concerning message ahead of a federal election where there are significant anxieties within our communities on whether or not the federal government, if it changes, is going to further its distance in supporting 2S LGBTQ communities and organizations. For us, we need to see commitments that are long-lasting and, frankly, election-proof. As a proud member of Dignity Network Canada, CCGSD echoes Cooperation Canada's welcoming of new funding for humanitarian programs. We are, however, we really wanted to see further commitment to the LGBTQI international assistance or any further movement on having a dedicated LGBTQIA special envoy. The global anti-gender movement poses a significant risk to queer and trans people everywhere. And Canada needs to be a leader right now to ensure its commitments on supporting LGBTQ rights, and that looks like funding human rights defenders around the world. Outside of the direct support for 2S LGBTQ communities, Budget 2024 has proven commitments for supporting youth that have already been discussed, and we're cautiously optimistic on what this is going to mean for 2S LGBTQ communities. Additionally, we are actually celebrating the fact that the Canadian Race Relations Foundation has had a commitment of ongoing permanent funding. This just shows what is capable with good advocacy and influencing, and we're hoping that this is going to have significant impacts for QT/BIPOC youth across this country. And so we're hearing the allyship from the federal government, but we're asking a little bit more for the sustainability of our communities who are at the front lines of this major backlash on LGBTQ rights. And we are asking all of our communities and allies to continue the advocacy and coordination to ensure that our communities are supported. Thank you.
Great, and you definitely have our support. Excellent. So now we're going to move over to Sahar Raza from the National Right to Housing Network.
Thank you, Deanna, and good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to say that on the housing front, in contrast to last year, we at the National Right to Housing Network actually see hope in Budget 2024. With the most bold and cohesive housing plan we've seen from the federal government in decades, this budget finally takes steps towards making the fundamental human right to adequate housing a reality in this country. And it does that by demonstrating national leadership in addressing critical areas like tenant rights, affordable housing, and homelessness through long called for measures, including a $15 million fund for tenant rights organizations to, among other things, claim their right to adequate housing under federal justice mechanisms. And this is significant because the next human rights review is on women's homelessness. Other measures include $1.5 billion to enable non-market housing providers to buy and preserve affordable homes, $1 billion to build deeply affordable and supportive housing as well as shelters, $1.1 billion to provide supports to asylum claimants, $1.3 billion for Canada's homelessness strategy and for encampment supports, and a renter's bill of rights to crack down on rent evictions and increase price transparency in the rental market. Now, I'm saying this while acknowledging that there is still a long way to go to rein in the private market and ensure true housing affordability. But I do want to celebrate that these measures are meaningful. They're a meaningful start for women, gender diverse people, Indigenous folks, Black and racialized people, people with disabilities, asylum seekers, and low-income folks who disproportionately face poverty, core housing need, and homelessness, and too often don't have access to the supports they need. In fact, we've been seeing Indigenous folks who engage in the simple act of keeping themselves alive in public spaces face some of the worst forms of colonial violence and human rights violations through government-led encampment clearings and other acts that criminalize homelessness. Meanwhile, in most major cities, the social housing waitlist is over 10 years, and we're losing affordable housing much faster than we could ever build it, which means more and more women and intersectionally marginalized folks are left to an extractive private market where rents are skyrocketing. I'm therefore grateful to see measures finally that put tenants and asylum seekers and people experiencing homelessness at the center, but acknowledge that this is just a start. Our government really needs to keep moving full speed ahead to strengthen and further invest in these positive measures while addressing the disproportionate investment and lack of regulation in the private market. There's various examples of this, but just as one, the $15 billion investment in the apartment construction loan program holds a bigger price tag than all of the other positive measures combined that I've already spoken about. But this program has produced virtually no affordable housing and provided no downward pressure on rents for over 7 years. So we therefore hope to see stronger measures to regulate the private market and improved affordability criteria across all federal housing programs, subsidies, and tax benefits in the fall economic statement. And we also hope to see clear targets for scaling up social housing, stronger targeting of women and other underserved communities, and stronger tenant protections in the Renters' Bill of Rights, like vacancy control. And this would ensure that public funds are used for public good in compliance with the right to adequate, affordable, and secure housing for women, racialized folks, and other underserved communities. Thanks.
Thanks, Sahar. Next, we have Kula Beg from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network.
Thank you so much, Diane. Kula Beg here, and joining today from Treaty 7 territory from a city called Calgary. I'm here to speak today from the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network's perspective about Budget 2024, and would just like to say that we are welcoming this ambitious housing budget that's been presented and was followed by multiple announcements leading up to the budget. But we would like to emphasize that without transformative focus on gender-based targets, the programs might not reach women and gender diverse people whose housing is often hidden, invisible, and puts them at risks of extreme violence. From all the investments coming under the Canada's Housing Plan from Budget 2024, we are most happy to see the Rapid Housing Initiative within the Affordable Housing Fund to be renewed, which many members within our network had applauded previously for its rollout during the pandemic. What is important to know is that previously the program had allocated 25% for housing allocated to women. We would like to echo calls from our intersectional feminist housing agenda that came out in December, calling for a 40% allocation for housing that is led by and primarily serving women and gender diverse people. Echoing what Sahar just said as well, one of the biggest investments that comes under Budget 2024 is under the Apartment Construction Loan Program, which was previously known as the Rental Construction Financing Initiative. And this program is one of the biggest pots of funding within the housing investments. It's $15 billion, and it's previously been known to do very little to address the affordability crisis, to lift those who are in greatest need out of housing precarity and housing insecurity. We fear that this investment continues to follow the supply side logic, which does little to making housing more affordable for those in need. And women and gender diverse people, particularly those from Black, Indigenous, racialized, and newcomer households, are often overrepresented in core housing need, and without affordability targets that are tied to income thresholds, we would be doing very little to lift those households out of housing insecurity. I'll also briefly speak to the Rental Bill of Rights and the Tenant Protection Fund. Again, great news that these are being centered in this budget. We know from all of our research that lack of security of tenure and access to justice disproportionately impacts women and gender diverse people, and lack of security of tenure being one of the biggest reasons why women lose their housing in the first place. We are calling for these investments to particularly look towards creating access to justice and security of tenure for women and gender diverse people, specifically looking at situations where women and gender diverse people are living in housing where they don't have any tenancy rights or protections at all. A quick last note about the Canada Disability Benefit. After years of advocacy, we saw a $200 per month announcement yesterday, and over 75% of women and gender diverse people experiencing housing insecurity report disabilities. We fear that this benefit is too little to really make a difference to housing insecurity experienced by women and gender diverse people experiencing disabilities. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Kula. Next, I would like to hand it over to Marie McGregor Pitwanakut from the National Indigenous Women Housing Network.
Good morning, everyone. I serve as the chair of the National Indigenous Women's Housing Network, and I serve also as a co-chair to the Women's National Housing and Homelessness Network. The budget announcements were encouraging, as each day some new amount was announced for various initiatives. I was encouraged by the announcement for $1 billion over 5 years to fund a new national school program for 400,000 more children. And also the Renters' Bill of Rights is important. I want to go back to a very important principle where the federal government, the highest honor of the crown is its fiduciary obligation to Indians, Indigenous peoples who are registered under the Indian Act. And one of the elements in the budget that addresses a little bit of that is the provision for some funding for emergency management of First Nations. I also want to see funding for tent communities, tent villages. And the way I see the people living in tent communities and tent villages is we should be regarding them as living national treasures. And the reason I say that is that anyone who can survive in a tent in a Canadian winter is persistent, resilient, and resourceful. And the view of the news media and lots of organizations kind of looking at them in a derogatory, negative way is not helpful, not productive. So I want to change the way people living in tents are viewed. And a good portion of people living in tents in municipalities and elsewhere off reserve are Indigenous peoples. I also want to say that those Indigenous peoples who are living off reserve are living on their traditional homelands, whether or not it's regarded as Indian Reserve. And so the big announcements about funding for new housing, those are all addressed to middle-class Canadians. I think we need to focus more on how to help those most in need. In other words, people living in tents, Indigenous women who are at risk of going missing or being murdered, those that are at risk of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. Those are all very important issues. And on that note, I'll stop and I say thank you very much for hearing me. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Marie. Next, we'll have Morna Valentine from Childcare Now.
Thanks very much, Deanna. Thanks to big federal investments in regulated early learning and childcare as of 2021, parent fees have dropped very rapidly, and childcare is now affordable for most families. This has been life-changing for those fortunate to find a regulated space. It's also led to a significant increase in the participation of women in the paid labor force. However, supply of regulated childcare is severely limited, and hundreds of thousands of families are being excluded from the $10 a day program. Childcare Now has been calling on all governments to properly fund the cost of building new licensed facilities and enlarging existing ones. We've also said that governments must take immediate and effective measures to expand the early learning and childcare workforce. The current shortage of qualified early childhood educators compromises quality. It means that existing programs cannot operate at full capacity, and it makes it very difficult for new facilities to open. So we're very pleased that the federal government's 2024 budget includes several measures in response to our appeal. Specifically, we applaud the creation of a new $1 billion federal childcare expansion loan program and $60 million in non-refundable grants to finance the costs of not-for-profit and public childcare expansion. The fund is going to be particularly helpful to the many nonprofit operators who want to expand their programs and set up new ones, but can't get access to private financing or can't afford the very high borrowing charges imposed by private lending institutions. We're also pleased that the federal government's large housing initiatives will incentivize the building of childcare facilities on public lands and elsewhere. It makes such good sense to locate childcare programs close to where families live and to include childcare in major public infrastructure projects. We would have liked to see more in the budget to support the early learning and childcare workforce. However, we note the federal government's commitment in the budget to push the provinces and territories to fairly pay early childhood educators and other staff in the sector, and to ensure that they have good pension coverage. We call on the federal government to ensure that the next provincial and territorial early learning and childcare action plans include specific measures to improve wages, pensions, and working conditions. The action plans are funded with federal dollars, and therefore the federal government has leverage to demand quick action and results. Finally, we're pleased that the challenges in early learning and childcare will be addressed by the sector table on the care economy announced in the budget, and we expect childcare advocates to be invited to join it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Morna. Next, we will hear from Katherine Scott from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives.
Thanks, Diana. And thanks to everyone. This is just a terrific opportunity to unpack the budget, enjoy it every year, and learn so much. I'm a senior researcher with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and we were in the lockup yesterday trying to pull things together. I want to acknowledge and note that certainly several important initiatives that target gender equality were announced. And many of my colleagues here have pointed them, certainly the new investments in housing, which are truly significant. And, our comment certainly was, had we started this in this place in 2017, we might well be in a very different place today with respect to housing stock and construction of social housing. I want to reiterate the importance, certainly, of the announcement of free birth control and diabetes medication. We were looking to the budget to see how those particular programs will be costed over the long term and how they might, but these are the seeds of universal pharmacare. That certainly is our hope that the program will evolve. The sectoral cable on the care economy certainly was an important ask in the alternative federal budget. Very pleased to see that. And as Morna's just mentioned, certainly the expansion and increased attention on childcare. There were some surprise moves, and I wanted to focus here on that in my few comments or my few minutes here. We were surprised, and all of a sudden, right before the budget in the last few days, we started hearing about whether there would be new revenue measures that would be targeting the wealthy. Indeed, the government brought in a new tax, or increased the tax that's paid on capital gains for the wealthiest individuals and corporations. This has been something we've been asking for literally decades. It's a move that will potentially raise $20 billion over the next 5 years and to be paid by the top 40,000 income earners in Canada. Certainly the rate of the tax on capital gains indeed used to be higher at or above the 66% that's being proposed in budget 2024 in the past, and it applied to all capital gains. But we were very pleased to see this initiative. Certainly it would signal that the government's finally responding to spending concerns. So our perspective was, bring it on. It's certainly time that Canada started to look more seriously at its revenue problem. This was a very welcome initiative. One of the other things I'd like to speak a bit about was that we were a surprise, perhaps, was the announcement of the Canada Disability Benefit. You know, obviously negotiations. This legislation passed last year, bringing in the benefit. There's been negotiations ongoing in the background. You know, we were wondering when, if and when the benefit. So it was we were pleased to see it appear. But as people have mentioned, several people have mentioned, we're hugely disappointed with the announcement. So, you know, right now at $2,400 a year, this was certainly not going to approach or make a huge dent in the appalling levels of poverty of the estimated 5 million people in this age group. So very tremendously disappointed, wanted to continue to focus and engage. You know, just a last comment about how these initiatives, you know, really follows a pattern. It feels like many small seeding change, but really not taking the opportunity to leverage the resourcing or putting in the funding necessary to really affect transformational change. It's a pattern over the last 8 years with the federal government, and we see it in budget 24. But, you know, obviously it's a call to dig deeper and push harder for, you know, as we move into the next year. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Catherine. Next, we have Messi Helos from the Canadian Centre for Women's Empowerment.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to join this call. I join you from the Unceded and Anishinaabe Algonquin territory in Ottawa. As the Canadian Centre for Women Empowerment is a national organization dedicated to address economic abuse, I share my disappointments like my colleagues, as there is no new investment on gender-based violence during this critical time. And I want to focus my remarks in 4 aspects on access to economic resource for victims of economic and financial abuse. We welcome the government allocation of $60 million over 5 years to expand the financial help services to ensure that this program helps particularly BIPOC women and gender diverse victims to file a tax, find a benefit, and to improve their financial security. We previously urged the federal government to invest on financial counseling to support victims and survivors. We want to see more investment as a part of the budget for financial advice service tailored to the needs of victims to assist them on the road to economic and financial crime recovery. We also welcome the government commitment on amendment of the Canadian Mortgage Charter to require banks to consider one-time rent payment when calculating renters' credit score. As a direct consequence of economic abuse and incarceration debt, survivors are often indebted and face low credit score. The proposed amendment in 2024 budget would make easier for victims of economic abuse to increase their credit score and have access to mortgage. And becoming homeowner lessen survivors' dependence on landlord and the chance of potential eviction while increasing their financial resilience. And this also creates intergenerational walls and reducing experience and continuous cycles of abuse. While also we appreciate the government effort to implement open banking framework to make financial service more accessible and flexible, we must be cautious against the potential dangers, particularly for victims and survivors. Open banking could further hide tech-facilitated violence and make it easier for abusive partner to weaponize financial service to control and exploit survivors economically. And we urge the federal government to consider to invest on further research best practices from other countries like United Kingdom and Australia, as we also highlighted in our Financial Future Summit, which was conducted last year. We also encouraged by the government new commitment on reducing cost of internet, home phone, and cell phone plan. Increasing access to this service is very critical for victims to live abusive relationship. Even our national research, which was conducted in 2022, reveals that 48% of social service providers noted that clients raised concern about their internet and home bill. We also heard that from survivors, it's very challenging, the so-called the family planning, switching providers after leaving abusive relationship. So CCFW therefore welcomed the government announcement to introduce a legislative amendment, Telecommunication Act, to prohibit service providers from charging victims switching fee and then make it easy for survivors and clients, even cancel and modify other services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Messi. And last but not least, we have Ian Thompson from Oxfam Canada.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be among this group of feminist voices. I'm joining from the unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, colonially known as Ottawa. I was in the budget lockup yesterday, and I'll start off just by focusing on the international front. As Oxfam, we were very interested to see what sort of foreign assistance would be included in the budget, and the government announced an additional 350 million over the next 2 years. That's going to be focused specifically on humanitarian assistance. There was no number for the overall foreign aid budget that was tabled in the budget yesterday. It was this new humanitarian assistance funding that was the one new announcement. And what's interesting about that is, I mean, it is the most politically safe way to announce foreign aid money. I think it's the most kind of supported from all parties. So that could be part of the calculation. I think what we'll need to advocate for as feminist organizations is that it is programmed in feminist ways. We certainly know the feminist international assistance policy has been transforming the way Canada intervenes and engages with the world. But when it comes to humanitarian assistance, we really do need to make sure that these new investments follow those feminist principles. It was also welcome to see that the budget reaffirmed the 10-year commitment around global health in international assistance, which includes $700 million per year for SRHR programming. So while we didn't get an overall envelope for the aid budget announced in yesterday's budget, it was good to see some of those major feminist commitments reaffirmed again this year. Now, on the domestic front, we were really looking at women's economic inequality and what the government would do to address the growing gender inequality when it comes to the economy. We welcome, as many others have mentioned on this call already, the investments in the care economy. It was great to see the childcare investments that have been mentioned already, and totally agree with other speakers who said the need for more workforce investments are needed next. We really need to center the care workers in order to build out the care systems we need. And Oxfam is very excited to hear about the sectoral table on the care economy that will be convened and the consultations on a national caregiving strategy. We're hopeful that caregivers, care workers, care providers are really centered in those consultations and in those recommendations so that women who are working in the care economy with underpaid or without pay are really at the center of those discussions. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, we've reached the end of the briefing. I just want to remind everyone, if there is interest in having further conversations with any of the speakers, please get in touch with any of us, and we'll be happy to provide contacts and information. Other than that, this webinar was recorded and will be available soon as well for further dissemination. We're happy to share that following this event. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us this morning, for hearing this very important perspective as part of the budget commentary. And yeah, I wish you a happy day. Thank you.